Chances are you know how the old saying goes. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. All right, it's the kind of folksy down-home wisdom that your grandma used to say when somebody was picking on you, just to try to ease the burden of someone's words. And the idea is simple, right? I mean, they're just words. If somebody assaults you with sticks and stones, you're probably going to walk away with at least a few bruises, a few bumps. But they're just words. And it's the down-home, folksy kind of wisdom that your grandma used to tell you. What if grandma was wrong? Right? Because chances are, for a lot of us, we probably resonate a bit more with a different version of that little proverb that made its way into the television show Scrubs. Now, throughout the show, the main character not only experiences what's happening in the show, but you also get the added perspective of his inner monologue, and he is anything if not a little self-insecure. And so after someone has kind of chewed him out, he spouts, "Sticks and stones may break my bones," before trailing off, and then you hear his inner monologue kick in, and he adds, "But words will hurt forever." And I think for a lot of us, that probably rings truer with our experience than with the folksy down-home wisdom that Grandma used to say. Because we know what it is for words. Even words spoken quickly in a moment have this power to linger and to sting over and over again as we replay them in our minds. In the world of the Old Testament, the assumption was that words mattered, that words had power to a degree that we probably don't have within our own culture, our own way of seeing the world. In the mindset of the ancient Near East, that if someone spoke words of blessing or words of curse, especially if it was someone in an official position or someone who had some sense of authority, it was assumed that those words mattered, that they carried weight, that those words were essentially the enacting of that blessing or that curse. And so there was this deep understanding that words mattered. And I think if our own battles with the voices that play in our heads tell us anything, it's that words still matter. Right? We can cling to this idea that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us, all that we want to. But our lived experience tells us something very, very different than that. And so the question that we have to wrestle through as the people of God is, how do we navigate the powerful words that are spoken over us, words that remind us of our limitations, words that remind us of our place, words about how ordinary we are, and still pursue the extraordinary things that God calls us to do? If we're going to admit that words seem to hold this power over us, that they do seem to sting, how do we navigate a world where we hear all of these words, all of these things that are spoken, and still pursue the extraordinary things of God? To begin to answer that today, I want to invite us into a moment in the life of God's people in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel. I mean, in 1 Samuel 17, this is a well-worn tale that no doubt many of you are familiar with. And it's a tale that comes from a point in Israel's life, in the life of the people of God, where they have transitioned after coming into the promised land from a tribal group of interrelated tribes to a monarchy under their first king, a guy by the name of Saul. And it's there, in the reign of Saul, that we find this tale in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to begin reading in verse 1. If you're in YouVersion, there in the app, you can click on the Events tab and follow along. Open a Bible, click on a device. 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Succoth in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim between Succoth and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So, a little bit of background here to help us understand what's happening. The Philistines, most likely, are part of a group of people that were moving into what we know as the Promised Land, Canaan, from the Aegean Islands around Greece. And they were migrating from the Aegean Islands about the same time that Israel is leaving Egypt and making their way to Canaan. And so, as we follow the biblical story, after the Exodus, we have Israel coming into Canaan from the east across the Jordan River. And we have the Philistines coming into Canaan from the west across the sea and settling on the coast. So we can see, just from a historical point of view, what's going to happen. We can assume that these people are going to come into some conflict because they are both emerging into the same place at the same time, looking for a new place to live. And so the Philistines, in line with their Greek origins, are here gathered for battle. Philistine camp on one hill, the Israelites on the other, a valley between them. And the Philistines say, "Hey, look, don't know how you guys do this, don't know why you're all lined up for battle like this. We can make this really, really easy. We'll send a guy, you send a guy, let them battle, and just decide the whole thing." And so the Philistine champion steps forward. And he's not just any soldier. The text tells us he stands nearly 9 feet tall. He is armed to the teeth. This guy is a war machine. His armor itself weighs approximately 125 pounds, not counting all of the other parts of his equipment. He is everything you can imagine in your worst nightmares for this champion to be. And no doubt, this isn't the first time the Philistines have pitched this sort of proposal when facing battle, right? It's probably safe to assume there have been other instances when the Philistines were drawn up for battle against someone, and they said, "Hey, we got an idea. Why don't we just settle this one-on-one?" And then they trot out Goliath, and guess what? He's still standing, which means he's good at this sort of activity. And so understandably, we can see why everyone in Saul's camp is running scared. There's no reason not to be afraid of this monster of a man who has stepped forward to defy the armies and the God of Israel. Now, just before this, the book of 1 Samuel has introduced us to David. 1 Samuel introduces us to David as the youngest son of Jesse, who's from Bethlehem. And he introduces David by telling us that Samuel, who had been leading Israel up until the time that they had demanded a king, that he went to Jesse's house to anoint God's hand-chosen successor, his chosen king. If that causes you to ask questions, it should, because we just said Israel already has a king, right? And his name is Saul. If you want the backstory, jump back a couple of chapters into 1 Samuel 15, and you can find out Saul did some boneheaded things that disqualified him from leadership. And so God sends word to the prophet Samuel to go and anoint David as the next king. But at this point, nobody knows about that yet. Safe to say it's going to lead to some conflict between Saul and David. But at this point, what we do know is that David's brothers are in service to Saul's army. So, right, there's the Philistine camp on this hill and the Israelite camp on this hill. David's brothers are in the camp on this hill. And Jesse has been sending David, his youngest son, back and forth with supplies for his older sons who are arrayed for battle against the Philistines. And so for 40 days, this Philistine champion has stepped forward from the ranks and challenged someone to come and fight him. As he does that, he curses Israel, he curses Yahweh God, and he challenges any man who has the gall to come and fight him and settle this score. We don't need a big battle. We don't need to have a bunch of casualties. You send a guy, we'll fight, and we'll settle this here and now. Well, as happens, one day, just as Goliath steps out to make his repeated challenge, David has come into the camp. And he hears the Philistines' words, and he begins to inquire what would happen if somebody took him up on the job. So what's the plan if somebody beats this guy? And word gets back to Saul that David is inquiring about the challenge. Let's jump back into the text at verse 31. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. So David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, and he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I can't go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. So David gets brought to Saul. Right? Many of you are familiar with this story. You know the details on all of the beats, but let's make sure we have all of this in our minds. David is brought before Saul, and there has to be a little bit of optimism, right? Because, hey, at least somebody is asking about the challenge. For 40 days, nobody has come forward. For 40 days, everybody has been hiding in fear, and now finally the king gets word somebody wants to know about what it takes to fight the Philistine champion. And so they bring David before him, and I can only assume that Saul had to think that his attendants, that his servants were playing a joke on him, right? Because they're like, Your Majesty, someone wants to fight the Philistine. And they're like, well, bring him in. Let's check out this guy. Let's see this warrior. And David comes walking in, and he's like, seriously? Like, seriously? You? This is the guy that wants to take on the Philistine champion? You? Saul reads the situation just like you or I would. Right? Like, put yourself in Saul's shoes for just a moment. For 40 days, nobody has stepped forward to take on this challenge. You finally get word that, hey, there's somebody in the camp who's ready to fight the Philistine. And then they bring in a shepherd boy. Say, here he is, Your Majesty. Here's our champion. Here is our fine warrior. And Saul reads the situation just like we would. He says, look, I appreciate the moxie, but you're just a kid. And that man out there, he's been killing people since he was a kid. You don't know what you are signing up for. Here's the thing that we often miss because we know how the story ends, right? And so we have this idea in our minds. This is what we often miss. Looking at it realistically, Saul is right. Is he not? What is at stake? What is at stake in this challenge? The existence of the people of God. If I beat your champion, you will become our subjects and serve us. And if by some chance he happens to beat me, yeah, sure, we'll serve you too. Right? It's not as if you get a redo. This is all the chips in. This is for everything. And Saul says, you want me to send this kid? Objective reality. He's right. This is the reality of the situation. But here's what we have to understand. Here, it's there in the teaching notes. You want to jot it down. Here's what we have to make sense of. Our ordinary expectations fail to factor in the presence of our extraordinary God. Right? Saul gets it right. But our ordinary expectations fail to factor in the presence of our extraordinary God. Saul sizes up the situation and says, we're going to send a shepherd boy to fight a war machine? The realistic, ordinary expectations are, if these two fight, a shepherd boy is toast. We're not even talking like 9 out of 10 times. 10 out of 10 times, these guys fight, and the shepherd boy is going to be toast. Those are the ordinary, realistic expectations of the situation. But our ordinary expectations fail to factor in the presence of our extraordinary God. And so David responds and he says, I know you're a little nervous, Saul, but you don't know the whole story. My whole life, I've been keeping sheep. Now, if that doesn't engender a lot of confidence in you, you can imagine how Saul must have felt. And he's like, excuse me, you've been keeping sheep. He's like, that's right, Your Majesty. My whole life, I've been keeping my father's sheep. And you know who loves lamb chops? Lions and bears. Jury was still out on tigers, apparently. Sorry, that was bad. And he says, but the Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear. And it gets obscured a little bit in translation. What he literally says is, and the Lord will deliver me from the paw of this Philistine too. And you kind of got to go, okay, now, is there more conversation here? The text doesn't tell us. What the text tells us is Saul says, okay, go, and the Lord be with you. I might be reading this in. I'll be honest with that. I don't know. I kind of read that as Saul going, it's your funeral, man. Lord be with you. God bless you. Nobody else wants to fight the guy, so have at it, I guess. Saul sends him to fight the Philistine champion. So here's David, the shepherd boy, going out to face the undisputed, undefeated Philistine champion. All because he had already warded off the lions and the bears from his father's sheep. Now let's let this sink in, gang. He is in a camp filled with soldiers. And it is the shepherd boy who steps forward to take on the extraordinary task. In a camp filled with excuses for doing nothing, David found the only reason he needed for doing something. And it wasn't because he was the best warrior. Right? He doesn't come to Saul with a list of bona fides like, hey, let me tell you about the last 10 champions I've fought. It wasn't because he was the best warrior. It wasn't because he was the biggest guy. In fact, subtly, early on, the text tells us when Saul was chosen as king, he stood head and shoulders above everyone else in the camp of Israel. David's not the biggest guy in the room. He certainly isn't the best warrior. But what he is an ordinary guy who refused to leave his extraordinary God out of his realistic expectations. And if we're going to say that words have power, we have to wrestle with this reality that we see here with Saul, is that sometimes the well-intentioned critique of other people's realistic expectations will keep you from attempting extraordinary things. Right? Saul looks at the situation, he reads it as it is. And he says, look, I don't think you know what you're signing on for. And when we're staring down the impossible, it is really, really easy to find excuses to do nothing. What if your confidence in your extraordinary God was the reason you needed to do something? We're good at finding excuses to do nothing, right? I'm not good enough. I don't have the know-how. I've already messed up. I don't have the time, the energy, the resources. The reality is, neither did David. He didn't have any of those things. But what he had was a lifetime of giving his best to the ordinary task of being a shepherd. That's it. That's what he walked into the room with. That's all that is on his resume. Is, Your Majesty, before you discount my willingness to go and fight the champion, you need to know I've been keeping my father's sheep. And it was precisely through his ordinary work that God had been preparing and equipping him for this extraordinary task. You see, it's there in the notes if you want to jot it down. The ordinary work that you have given yourself to might be preparing you for the extraordinary work God is giving you. The ordinary work that you've been giving yourself to, and you just think it's just mundane, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count, that might be the thing that is preparing you for the extraordinary work that God has for you to do. don't discount what you can do because you're afraid of what you can't do. That doesn't get you anywhere. Give yourself to the mundane. Give yourself to the ordinary because God might be using it to prepare you for something you can't imagine. So here's David, set to go out and face the Philistine, the undefeated, undisputed champion of the world. And Saul says, well, if you're going to go and try this, let's at least make you look the part. And so he puts David in his tunic, he puts David in his armor, he straps his sword onto David and says, all right, now you at least look like a warrior. David tries, he says, I can't go in these things, I don't know them. I'm not a soldier, I'm a shepherd. And so he sets them aside. And what does he do? He leans into the ordinary tools of his ordinary task. Just sticks and stones. A staff in his hand, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he heads off to face the champion. Let's jump back into the text at verse 41. Now, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all into our hands. And as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. So David goes out to fight, and the Philistine begins to berate him. Am I a dog that you would come at me with a stick? Of all Saul's army, you're the best they could do. Of everyone in the camp, you're the guy they've chosen. I don't know about you. This may not square with your experience. It certainly fits with what I've seen in mine. Whenever I've tried to faithfully pursue God's work, there's always this kind of voice. Sometimes it's an external voice of people's realistic expectations. Kind of like Saul going, really? Seriously? Sometimes it's my own inner dialogue, my own self-doubt. And sometimes it's the voice of the enemy. It begins to heckle and tear down, to convince you of the impossibility of what God has called you to do before you've even started attempting to do it. And if you set out to trust God, to do extraordinary things with your ordinary experience, you can almost be assured that you will hear the voice of the enemy planting seeds of doubt. Get in there in the notes if you want to jot it down. Guys, the enemy will demean you in order to dissuade you. Don't allow the voice of the enemy to distract you from the victory of God. The enemy will demean you in order to dissuade you. So don't allow the voice of the enemy to distract you from the victory of God. Goliath had spent 40 days speaking fear and doubt into the armies of Israel. Don't tell me words don't have power. For 40 days, the battle had not even begun to be waged. Not a single arrow was fired, not a single sword was unsheathed. All because of the power of the words of the Philistine champion who defied the armies and the God of Israel. He had spent 40 days speaking fear and doubt. And any chance that the Israelite camp thought they had in battle had withered away at the idea of somebody, anybody, being able to take this guy on one-on-one. And now that somebody has finally stepped forward, it turns out it's just a shepherd boy with sticks and stones. And so Goliath returns to his taunts. Am I a dog? Man, I'm going to carve you up, son. You don't know the fight you've picked. The enemy will demean you to try and dissuade you. So don't let the voice of the enemy distract you from the victory of God. And Goliath assumed, no doubt, either David would turn back, we'd be back to the same place we were before he stepped forward, or that he would have an easy time dispatching this young warrior. But instead it was David, armed only with ordinary sticks and stones, and the presence of his extraordinary God, who toppled the Philistine champion. Well, we have to see, anytime you want to do something extraordinary, to pursue the things of God, there will always be plenty of voices spewing out plenty of words as to why the extraordinary can never happen. There will be plenty of words reminding you why you are the least likely person to make a difference for the kingdom of God, how all the odds are stacked against you, how all the things you've ever done haven't really amounted to anything. There will always be plenty of excuses for doing nothing. What if your confidence in your extraordinary God became the only reason you needed to do something? Just stand with me as we pray and invite the band to come back.